I'm Ray, teacher and tutor, and I am back to talk about cognitive load and how that affects learners both at home and within the classroom. What is cognitive load? Well, cognitive load is the theory devised by psychologist Dr. John Sweller, and he proposed this idea that human beings have a limited capacity to learn information, and the amount of effort required to take in new information and then apply it in the future is called cognitive load. So the load is the name given to the amount of effort it takes to process. So when we talk about cognitive load, there are three types we need to consider. We've got intrinsic, extraneous, and germane. Intrinsic cognitive load is the inherent complexity of the information that is being delivered. So the concepts within the idea that you're trying to teach. The more complex they are, the more effort is required for the learner to process that information. So this is where it might be really important to chunk it down. Strenuous cognitive load is the unnecessary cognitive load that is being put upon the learner. So it's effort that is being used up through things like deciphering materials or trying to understand through a new form of medium. So poorly designed materials, poorly designed instructions, this will all cause extraneous cognitive load, and it can really affect how that learner is picking up that new concept, those new ideas, a new bit of knowledge. Finally, we have germane cognitive load. So this is a very useful form of cognitive load. This is when new information is being organized into existing knowledge and concepts. So this will make it easier to recall in the future, and it helps embed it into our long-term memories. So to those who are very familiar with educationalists and educational psychology, will probably think germane cognitive load theory sounds familiar. Well, that's because it is very closely linked with schema theory. And schema theory, just to give you a very quick brief, is where information is organized into certain mental structures and you are able to link new information into it. That is essentially what it is, and Dr. Sweller's proposed ideas and theories are very closely linked, and in fact they run parallel to the idea that if you are learning a new bit of information, having it linked to other pre-existing pieces of information can help that learner and actually ease cognitive load. So, minimizing cognitive load, how do we do it? Well, there are a whole host of ways that we can do this, and Dr. Sweller proposes some, but I'm going to say some strategies that I've used within the classroom. And one that is the oldest time is learning objectives, learning intentions, and success criteria, or steps to success. And what they do is they help direct the learner's attention into exactly what they need to learn and exactly what the outcomes of the lesson are. This then reduces the cognitive load of them having to try and guess or guess what you're thinking as an educator, or perhaps come up with a new creative way of displaying all of the information that they've taken in. And this actually links very closely into another strategy, such as providing them with either a checklist or an example or finished piece of work, or both. So by doing this, by giving them a checklist, they know the way they need to set out a task, the way they need to answer perhaps a set of questions, or how they display their information. And by having an example there, they're not having to have that extra worry, that extra panic of what's the teacher looking for, what am I expected to do. They can just focus straight on the information, and that helps reduce cognitive load. Another way you can do this is by ensuring that the information you give comes from a very precise singular source, and that unnecessary superfluous complexity is taken out. If you're adding in unnecessary information, the learner may not completely understand what you want them to learn, and that then increases cognitive load, and you might find that the key aspects of the lesson you're trying to teach get lost somewhere in the ether. The ethers don't exist. But anyway, we'll go on to that another time. Another way we can reduce cognitive load is by practicing beforehand. So whenever we do pieces of writing in schools, usually we do a bit of planning first. We plan out what we want it to look like. We then maybe edit it, might write it again, might plan it, edit. All of these help reduce cognitive load on the brain because you're not having to store all of that information in. Once it's written down, you can then focus on how do I improve each paragraph. Maybe I need to rewrite it. And then you can go away, come back the next day, and perhaps now you've seen that, you've seen your edits, and you've come up with more ideas. You're not having to store all of that in your head. Or perhaps it's a maths question, and perhaps you're doing dividing fractions is one of my favorites, and you use KFC as a key pivot limit changer. By having those instructions placed out, maybe in their book on a bit of extra paper, scaffolding, and maybe some worked examples, they're able to practice those first and then go into problem solving afterwards. That way, they're not having to remember what you've said. They can remember what you've said. They've got the scaffold there. They've got the examples, perhaps in their book or right in front of them. And they've done it time and time again to the point where the instructions that they're trying to hold in are shortened and organized a bit more clearly. And that actually comes on to another theory of Dr. Sweller's, which is the reversal instruction effect, I believe it's called. Expertise reversal effect. And the expertise reversal effect means instructions that were once given to a beginning learner may change as they become better at a task or understanding a piece of knowledge, because the instructions are no longer suited to what they're trying to learn. For example, if you're trying to teach a child how to make a cheese sandwich, you might be very specific with the set of instructions. But if you're telling an adult what you would like in their cheese sandwich, you probably don't have to include the parva grating cheese or buttering bread. That's something that's already known. You're adding different bits of information in. Another thing you need to really look out for is something called the split attention effect. So the split attention effect is what Dr. Sweller suggests when a child or a learner is taking in information from a variety of sources at once. This can be overwhelming, and it can be very hard to pick out all that information and organize it and decide its relevancy. That's a lot of pressure on the brain. So what Dr. Sweller suggests is by having it from one singular source. Now, this is not to say that you can't teach through multi-sensory approaches, which is very good, but when you're doing it, do it one at a time. Okay, don't have a video playing with sound and then another sound coming from here while they also have to read a research paper at the same time and write something out. That's far too much for the brain to be able to comprehend, and information will most certainly be missed. What does cognitive load feel like? Well, I can almost say with certainty that you felt this at some point in your life, but we're going to go through a bit of a demo now. Now, the way I'm going to do it is through maths. I actually really enjoy maths, but I know there are people out there that are panicking by the mere sound of the word maths or mathematics, and it's given them PTSD flashbacks of school. Today's lesson is actually going to be on the properties of triangles. I'm going to go through 4 different triangles, and I will say I'm purposely going to teach this poorly. So if you're thinking, oh my goodness, how did he get his qualification? Not by teaching this way. I'm going to try and cognitively overload you by giving you excessive information and go through it at a pace that would be very difficult to keep up if you are unfamiliar with these concepts. If you are familiar with these concepts, perhaps you're a teacher, parent, or mathematician, just all-round genius, this will be perhaps quite easy for you because this is already in your pre-existing schemas. But anyway, let's go. So let's get started with the very bad lesson. There are 4 different types of triangles. I'm going to go through the names of those triangles. We have equilateral, scalene, isosceles, and right angle triangle. So let's start with the scalene triangle. What is a scalene triangle? Well, like all triangles, scalene triangles have 3 sides, but all 3 sides are of different angles and different sizes. This is very different to the isosceles triangle, which has 2 equal sides and 2 equal angles, or congruent angles as you might call them. The side that is not of the same length is called the base, or typically called the base. Now, an isosceles triangle has 1 line of symmetry, whereas a a scalene triangle will have no lines of symmetry or no lines of rotational symmetry. The isosceles triangle is very similar to the right angle triangle, which can have one line of symmetry going through, providing A and B are of equal length. Talking about right angle triangles, the name right angle triangle comes from the fact that it has a right angle. As we know, a right angle is 90 degrees, and the side opposite the 90-degree angle is called hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is the longest side of that shape. How do we work out hypotenuse? Well, hypotenuse is worked out by using Pythagoras' theorem. An ancient Greek philosopher and mathematician that apparently came up with the idea of working out the hypotenuse, which is a squared plus b squared equals c squared. So that's a times by itself plus b, also squared, is equal to side c, the hypotenuse, which is squared. So to actually find the answer of what the length is, you need to find the square root of side c. Now, this is very interesting, but not as interesting as the equilateral triangle, which has all sides and all angles of congruent length and degrees. So, in an equilateral triangle, you actually have 3 lines of symmetry. So, this is very different from the scalene, which has no lines of symmetry, but slightly different from the isosceles, which has 1 line, and slightly different from the right angle, which also has 1 line. So, when we're talking about symmetry, equilateral triangle does it best. Anyway, I hope you've learned something about the different types of triangles. Or probably haven't, but that's okay, because you're not supposed to. Okay, so now let's think, how could I have improved that bit of a lesson? Well, there are so many ways, and we could be here all day. But let's start with number 1. I did give you a learning intention. I did say that we are learning about the 4 different types of triangles, but a nice breakdown success criteria of what you're going to need to know by the end would be very helpful. That way you know where to send your information. Organize your information. So if I was to say we need to know how many sides are equal, how many angles are equal, how many lines of symmetry does it have? Okay, if I broke it down to those 3 things, it would have been so easy for you to remember and take notes. Second thing, or perhaps maybe even the first thing, is I would have given you a visual, something that you can see happening on the board. Now, this could have been a table with the 4 different types of triangles on there, or I could have spoken about them individually. I could have categorized them by property and then talked about them all in one go. So I could have said, right, we're looking at angles, equilateral, all angles are 60. Isosceles, 2 angles are the same and 1 unknown angle, and then scalene, and so on and so forth. Okay, we could have looked at it like that. So we're categorizing, we're organizing it. So a visual support there, categorizing information. The other way I could have helped is by perhaps giving you a sheet or an example of all of the properties already laid out. It's not cheating. I've given you the information, yeah, and you can look down it or tick it off as we're going through, or add little bits of extra information if you'd like, as it's in front of you. That doesn't mean that you're not learning anything, or you're cheating, which is the other idea some people have. It's just there to help ease your cognitive load. Another way I could have done it is, if you remember, I went equilateral, scalene, isosceles, right angle. I could have started equilateral, isosceles, scalene and right angle, started with equilateral and said, right, all 3 sides are the same, then 2 sides are the same, no sides are the same, no sides are the same. And if I would have numbered them out on the board, that would have been even better, board by board, imaginary bit of paper. Because I gave you the order of them, the 4, and then I decided to start with number 2 for some strange reason. Now, you might think that that's a very small little bit of difference that doesn't matter, but in your head's picking up on these little bits of patterns. So it's important, if you're going to say something in order, follow it back through in that order. It will really help. Finally, I would say probably the speed at which I was talking and the intonation of my voice. I wasn't making it clear when certain key aspects were coming up. I was using just different types of pitches all over the place. I was jumping forward and backwards from information. I started talking about Pythagoras, adding in allegedly, which is a whole nother thing. You go, what did he mean by allegedly? Did he not come up with it? Blah, blah, blah. Why is he talking about Greeks now? What do I know about Greek? Oh, olives, olive oil, wonderful. I like Greece. I've been there once, Athens. I went to the Acropolis. all of that extra information that they could go off on a tangent, and all of a sudden you've lost them and they're not picking up the key bits of information that they need to learn in the first place. So there are, like I said, there are so many ways I could have taught that better, and I'm sure once upon a time I probably did teach like that, but this is where we learn from. So we break it down, we keep it simple, we reduce cognitive load by taking out all that unnecessary information, perhaps giving a sheet or a bit of information in front, so if they do miss something, if they're worrying about how something's spelt, they've got it in the front of them. They know that not to listen to me about Pythagoras and ancient Greece, because in my 6 steps to success, I said you only need to know about symmetry, angles, and length of sides. Okay, so let's say they go off on a tangent, at least they know this is not relevant whatsoever. Okay, and it keeps them on task. So hopefully I've given you a bit of a breakdown of what goes through a teacher's head when they're reflecting on a lesson and how they could do it better in the future. And hopefully it's given you some ideas as well on how to perhaps teach anything, whether it's your hobby, like a musical instrument or gymnastics, or maybe you're an educator or a parent who's home educating. It's given you a bit of an insight into how to direct your teaching more effectively. Lastly, what I want to do is I want to go through a summary of what the video has been all about and things that we have learned. I'm going to keep it very brief, and hint, this is another way we can minimize cognitive load by going back over it so you can see what you've missed. So number 1, we looked at what is cognitive load. Cognitive load is the amount of effort given or needed to process information. Who came up with it? Dr. John Sweller. What did he say? He said that we have a limited capacity to process information. Too much will then lead to lost learning. Well, the 3 different types of cognitive load. We have intrinsic, so the complexity of the information; extraneous, so the materials used and the way the information is being presented; and germane, which is linking back to the schema theory, where it organizes information into pre-existing knowledge. Then we looked at minimizing. So when we looked at minimizing, we were looking at things such as learning objectives and success criteria, focusing the attention. We looked at making sure that information is given by a single source, so we don't get the split attention effect, which means that information from multiple sources is a bad idea. It increases cognitive load. We also looked at providing some scaffolding, some bit of information in preparation, some examples, some tasks or checklists, so the child or learner is very aware of what they need to do to be successful. After that, I gave you a very terrible lesson on what cognitive load may feel like and how difficult it can be for a learner to take in lots of information at once. We then reviewed the lesson afterwards and looked at how we can perhaps structure or improve that lesson to ease cognitive load. So hopefully, like I said, you've learned something new, or if you've not learned something new, it's just giving you a bit of a refresher from something you knew once upon a time. If you have liked this, if you'd like to see more videos about learning and the way our brain works, then hit like, follow, subscribe. I will say I'm not a psychologist, I'm just a very keen educator. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Take care. Good luck.